Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck for you, and just as a quick heads up, this is not a budget deck, although I do think it should be fairly easy to find substitutes for those expensive cards. But before we do that, just a quick reminder to please click subscribe if you enjoy my videos. I'm currently growing the channel and I'm getting very close to 1,000 subscribers, so it would mean the world to me if you could support me. And today we're going to be talking about Rona, Herald of Invasion. For 1 colorless and 1 blue, it's a legendary creature, human wizard, 1/3, with whenever you cast a legendary spell, untap Rona, Herald of Invasion. And tap, draw a card, then discard a card. And finally we have 5 colorless and 1 phyrexian transform Rona, activate only as a sorcery. Of course that means she has a flip side, which is Rona, Tolarian Obliterator, a legendary creature phyrexian wizard, 5/5 with trample, and whenever a source deals damage to Rona, Tolarian Obliterator, that source's controller exiles a card from their hand at random. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield under your control. Otherwise, you may cast it without paying its mana cost. So I must admit, when I first saw this card, I liked it, but I also thought that it was kind of going in too many different directions. It wants you to care about legendaries, it wants you to care about looting, it wants you to care about receiving damage. There's just so many things that you could really build around here, so I kind of narrowed it down a little bit with this deck. Obviously, where possible, I tried to include cards that synergize with multiple different angles of what she does, but for the most part, we're going to be focusing on the flip side more. We have a bunch of cards that are pingers, which means that they can hit her for 1 damage, and then we can exile a card from our hand and play it for free, which is obviously super nice. We also have a couple of ways to force her to be blocked, but that shouldn't come up that often. And then we also do have quite a few creatures with activated abilities, so we have some cards that are going to be doubling that, and a few legendaries to also untap her and get some nice value off of her. And before we get going with the deck list, I just want to say that because she is a 2-mana legend that allows us to loot, we are running slightly fewer lands than normal. We should be able to get there by drawing a lot of cards. So anyway, without further ado, let's get started, and we're starting with Arcanus the Omnipotent. So this fits the deck for a couple of reasons. One, it's a big creature that is nice if we play for free off of Rona, but then also it's just going to tap to allow us to draw 3 cards. We have a few cards that synergize with card drawing and some cards that synergize with activated abilities, so this works really well here. Archon of Cruelty is obviously a great top-end card and one of the best ones we can cheat out with Rona. The ability is random, so we might not always hit it, but still, really great. Body of Knowledge is great to cheat out, and we are drawing a lot of cards in this deck, but also, crucially, it works really well with the pingers in our deck. We can just tap them to deal 1 damage to this and instantly draw a card. That's very nice. Containment Construct works really well with the front side of Rona. It's going to allow us to discard stuff and then still play it, so it's going to make our discard slightly better. Cornbadge Witches is a really old card, but in this deck it can be interesting, particularly if you get to use it politically. If you're behind or you want to help someone else out, or if you're behind and you have an ally on the table, you can just ask them to ping your Rona with their instance of the ability, and that way you're getting 2 triggers off of her, which is really great. Endbringer is going to be really great when we have Rona flip to the other side, because we're untapping it during each player's untap step. That means that we're going to be able to deal damage to Rona 3 different times. Really good. Do make sure that you can cast it by including enough colorless sources. Urtai Resurrected is going to give us a nice little bit of interaction, and it's good if we flip it off of Rona. Also, it's a legendary, so that's always good. Gixian Puppeteer I really like in this deck, since we're often going to be drawing multiple cards a turn, and then it's just nice to have a little bit of recursion off of this, particularly since we're discarding a lot. Hullbreaker Horror is an excellent top-end card that is great to hit off of Rona's ability, and then obviously it also provides a nice degree of protection to your board. If you have this in play and mana open, you're probably feeling pretty safe. Jace Vryn's Prodigy is going to work super well in this deck. Our graveyard's going to flip very easily, so it's going to be very easy to get him to the other side, and in the meantime it's just a looter, which is something this deck really likes. Jingataxia's Core Augur is another great top-end card, and it's super cheap right now with its recent printing. So yeah, hitting this off of Rona is going to feel really, really disgusting, because you're immediately going to draw 7 cards, and then your opponents are really going to struggle during their turns. Jingataxia's Progress Tyrant is going to work really well in the deck. We have a lot of the 3 card types that it requires, so yeah, we should be able to get quite a nice bit of value off of this. Kozilek Butcher of Truth is a great card to hit off of Rona's ability, and not much needs to be said about the Eldrazi. They're just awesome finishes. Ledger Shredder is just a great card in a lot of decks at the moment, and obviously we have synergy with looting, so this is going to be great. Min Wiley Illusionist is going to work really well with all of our looting synergy. We're drawing so many cards that it should be easy to trigger this. And if we get enough illusions out, it's another way that we can cheat on mana for our big creatures. Nezahal Primal Tide is another great top-end card that can work really well when we hit it off of Rona. Rona. Oscar Rubbish Reclaimer should be very cheap to play in this deck, and it provides a similar effect to Containment Construct, although it's a little bit more limited. Pestilence Demon is really great in this deck because it's super flexible. We can use it as a board wipe by dumping a bunch of mana into it, or we can just use it a couple of times every turn to get a bunch of triggers off of Rona and play all of our hand for free, which is great. Plague Spitter is going to trigger Rona's ability once on each of your upkeeps. That's already fantastic, but also if it dies, it gets to trigger it again. That shouldn't be too difficult to do. In addition to that, Plague Spitter and similar effects such as Pestilence Demon are going to work really well in this deck because we do have ways to give them Death Touch, so they can just be a board wipe very, very easily. Prodigal Sorcerer gets to deal damage to Rona, and we can also give it Death Touch. Same with Rootwater Hunter. Shadowgrange Archfiend is excellent as a good card to hit off of Rona that we can also play for cheap with its Madness ability. Shield Rip the Apocalypse is going to work really well because we are drawing a ton of cards. This should save us a lot of life. We're not using it for the mean part of hurting our opponents, but it is something to take into account. Sukata Firewalker is just another pinger. Termination Facilitator I really like in this deck because we've got so many pingers that this can actually be very legit removal. We're just going to tap it every turn to put a bounty counter on stuff. We can also copy that activated ability, and then all of our pingers just suddenly remove stuff on demand. It's really good. Thornwind Fairies is another good pinger. Thrashing Wumpus is basically another copy of Pestilence Demon. Toxtril the Corrosive is just a big finisher that we can hit off of Rona. We want a decent number of these because obviously the effect is random. We want to make sure that we have a good chance of hitting something good. Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger is another big finisher. Unctus Grand Metatech is actually going to work really well in a deck with this many creatures with activated abilities and a lot of pingers. It means that we're going to get to loot even more. Voha Vodalian Desecrator is another looter that can occasionally reuse stuff from the graveyard or deal damage to our opponents. And Zurin Spellcaster is another pinger. Next we have our artifacts. We have Acorn Catapult, which is not only a sweet flavor card, it's actually really good in this deck because we get to deal 1 damage to Rona with it, and we get a creature as well. Basilisk Collar is going to give Death Touch and Lifelink to something that can be really good in a deck with this many pingers. It's also cheap to equip, so we can just ping with one thing, then equip it onto something else and ping with that. Caltrops is a really interesting one. Now, usually this card isn't great, but this works really well against token decks, and it's also going to deal 1 damage to Rona, Body of Knowledge, and all those creatures that care about taking damage when they attack. So it's just about worth running, particularly if your meta has a lot of tokens in it. If your meta does not have that many token decks, then maybe don't play this. Gorgon's Head is another way to give Death Touch to our creatures. Nemesis Mask is an interesting one because it is going to force everyone to block Rona. Usually that's going to mean that she's probably going to die, but we are going to get a ton of triggers off of her ability with this. Rings of Bright Hearth is going to allow us to copy any activated ability. That's obviously going to be really, really great in this deck. And the Might Stone and Weak Stone might seem a bit weird, but hear me out. It's a legendary card, so that means that it's going to trigger Rona's first part. Coming in with a removal spell or card draw is great. And then even though the mana's a little bit restrictive, we do have quite a few artifacts in the deck, and we do have a few abilities that require mana to be activated, so this can be pretty decent, I think. Pylon is a pretty decent card, and we do have some synergy with surveilling and putting stuff into the graveyard, so this is pretty solid. Shivering Rot is one of the most interesting cards in the deck, so it has 2 modes, one of which says that whenever a creature takes damage this turn, it's going to die, so that works really good with all of our pestilence effects and pingers. And then the other side says whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from play, that creature's controller loses life equal to its toughness, so this can be a really weird finisher in certain situations, particularly if we play the full 7 mana. We can use all of our pingers or pestilent effects to wipe the board and deal a ton of damage to our opponents. We do have to make sure that we are at a higher life total than them though. Next up we have Whale of the Nim. This is another interesting card. So again, it has 2 fairly unusual modes. The first one allows us to regenerate each creature we control. That can be really good as protection against board wipes. And then the second one deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. Now usually that might not be good enough, but it does hit Rona for 1 damage, which is decent, and against small decks or token decks this can be a pretty good card. And since the Entwine cost is so cheap and both modes are fairly flexible, I think it's good enough to include in the deck. For sorceries, we have Breach the Multiverse. I love this card as a way to get a huge amount of fatties into play really quickly. Reanimate is going to allow us to reuse one of our big creatures from the graveyard. Stitch Together should almost always be on in this deck since we're filling up our graveyard so much, and at that point it's a really good reanimate spell. And Yawgmoth's Vile Offering also allows us to reuse cards from our graveyard, and crucially it's a legendary spell, so it's going to work really well with Rona. Next up we have Festering Evil. It's just another way to repeatedly trigger Rona. One with the Multiverse is a great finisher card, and it's a good one to play for free with Rona, but then it also allows us to dump bigger creatures that might be stuck into our hand into play for free. Pestilence is another great way to deal 1 damage to everything, and Teferi's Ageless Insight is going to work well with all of the card draw and looting that we have in this deck. Finally, we're moving on to lands. We only have 3 to talk about here. We have Bajuka Bog, which is great for dealing with opponents' graveyards, Tectonic Edge, which is going to be great for dealing with problem lands, and the most spicy edition, which is Desert Desert is usually a card that shouldn't be anywhere near most commander decks, but in this deck it's quite good. If we attack with Rona and she survives until the end of combat, we can tap this to deal 1 damage to her and then get to trigger her ability again. That's really solid, and then occasionally you can still pick off smaller stuff against our opponents. So there you have it. That has been our Rona Herald of Invasion deck tech. What do you think about this one? I think it's a pretty out of the box and unique one, and I think it should be pretty fun to play. Also, if you have any commander that you would like to see a deck tech for from the new set, please let me know in the comment section below. What do you think? Are there any things you would change? Any additions that you think I missed? Please let me know in the comment section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care. Woo!